I'm Rob Trasinski. This is Symposium, where we talk about the ideas at the basis of a free society. My guest today is Louis Anslow, who is the creator and curator of the Pessimist Archive. Thanks for coming on.
Hey, Robert, how are you?
Great, great. Now, I want to talk a little about, I've been following the Pessimist Archive for a while and found it incredibly useful and enlightening. So I want you to talk a little bit about what the Pessimist Archive is and what sort of prompted you to start this, what the idea behind it was.
Yeah, it's funny. It's there are a number of things that prompted me, and it's a little bit of a blur which of them came first. But I know that when I was a kid, I found it extremely irritating how cynical adults were about new things. The conservatism that kind of develops over age. Just found it very annoying. There would be these new innovations coming, and I'd be like, holy, this is crazy. I'm so into this. And then all the news and the adults would just be like, oh, duh, duh. And I'd just be like, guys, what's happened to you? Like, this is incredible. And you're just seeing the glass half empty, or the glass, 1/10 empty, as is often the case when there's something new and amazing comes along. So that was always something that was there as part of my childhood. And then in my sort of 20s, I noticed a couple of sort of newspaper clippings that had sort of gone viral on Reddit, one or two here and there, that were cynical about something that was new at the time. And I remember going, well, that's interesting. And I sort of started putting them in a folder, like a couple here, a couple there. And then one day I discovered online newspaper archives, and Google had a free one. And I just thought, I'll just type in bicycle. And it was like this, it was like the scene in Matrix where the Neo wakes up in the like chamber. It's just like, oh, I see. Like this has been happening forever. And like people said this about the bicycle and everything else. And
So
it
these
was
are
a bit,
articles like from 1893 talking about the
yeah,
scourge of the
exactly.
bicycle, right?
And it was crazy, crazy stuff, like really wacky stuff that you wouldn't believe was real. Um, and then it kind of felt like I don't know, it's a bit like when you're reflecting on let's say you're doing therapy or something and you notice, or behavioral cognitive therapy where you notice a dysfunctional pattern that you keep repeating. And then you're like, oh, I'm just doing that thing over and over again. It felt like that, but for like civilization or like just humans in general. You're like, oh, it was like this moment of like, it's hard to describe, like like civilizational self-reflection, where you're like, oh, okay, this is just conservatism. This is just culture war. This is just like the same experiment being run over and over again and getting the same output.
Yeah. Well, you talk about it as being conservatism, but it's conservatism not so much as an ideology, but conservatism as a bipartisan across the spectrum
Yeah, right. Yeah,
psychological tendency.
well, I think, yeah, I think we're all like, obviously, I don't mean conservative. It's a bit, there are lots of terms to use, but I guess it's like, just like, if you think of, because I don't think conservatism is like bad, generally bad, but like, I'm talking about like reactionary conservatism, like the sort of crazy, ignorant, sort of hysterical type of, like, I guess that's what I mean. And when you look at this stuff, you realize that like everyone's a conservative. Everyone's a conservative. That's the thing. Just
Yeah,
the villains become different.
there's left-wing
Yeah. And so
conservatism
what
as
I
well.
really like, absolutely. And that's what you realize with technophobia. It's like, it is really like, uh, it's present on the left, and it has been, especially in the first part of the 21st century with GMOs and a lot of other things. You realize that we're all vulnerable and prone to this stuff. It's like a bug in our system, and these things just, they, yeah.
Yeah, you talk about how there's a natural cycle with a new technology where people first are afraid of it and then they begin to accommodate it, then it becomes indispensable.
Yeah, well, this is the Gartner hype cycle, right? You're familiar with that, and it's
Right.
like there is this uh the peak of inflated expectations. So there is actually this period where actually the press are quite positive. It's like a brief period, and it kind of inflates the bubble. But the funny thing is, the press are like they're not critical when they need to be. like like oh sorry they're not critical when they need to be, so like you're seeing it with crypto right now, like a lot of a lot of sort of crypto scams were pumped up by um the press.
Mm-hmm.
They were reported on like how much money was going to them, blah blah blah. And there was a lot of like stuff like that, and they kind of didn't do the job they should have been doing at that point. But then and then after the peak of inflated expectations, you get the trough of disillusionment, which is when the bubble bursts, and then the press just write everything off. So I call this the gold rush fallacy, where like there's a gold rush in a bubble and everyone gets excited and carried away, and then the bubble pops, and then everyone assumes that gold, the underlying asset, is not valuable, but it is. Gold's valuable. Just because there was a gold rush and like everyone overinvested in mining for gold doesn't mean gold isn't valuable. So that's another interesting thing. I think it happened with the bicycle, happened with video games in the 80s,
Comic
happened
books
with
in
the
the
PC in
50s.
the 80s. Yeah, like there's this, and then that's what's happening with crypto now, right? We're in the trough of disillusionment. Everyone's like, digital gold is not worth anything. The underlying assets are valueless, and it's not. Yeah, I forgot what your question was.
Well, the question was the cycle, but I've talked about the cycle by which eventually what happens is
Mm-hmm.
after the initial techno-pessimism, it begins to be accepted, and then it becomes just something we can't do without. And I think the final stage is the new tech, what was once the new technology becomes our cherished way of life that's under threat by whatever the newer technology is.
Yeah, and we have this weird amnesia, right? So right now, the Web3 critics are saying, Web2 was obviously valuable, and it wasn't like this, and blah blah blah, and that's just complete bullshit. Like even Tim Berners-Lee is sort of railing on Web3, but if you look back, he was railing on Web2. He was saying this isn't how I imagine the internet. Like he's always trying to be this like sort of turncoat critic. And it's like, dude, you said this about Web 2.
Right.
You were railing on Web 2, saying Web 1 was this like Nirvana, it was this like Eden. And a lot of the web, I mean, Molly White, who's become sort of quite an influential critic of Web 3, like she's a moderator on Wikipedia, which is like one of the most idealistic, unrealistic sort of visions of Web 1 that has persisted today, and it's widely considered fairly resistant to disinformation, and it's just like this incredible monument to the visions of a global village. They don't, I mean, I haven't heard her talk about that or reckon with that in any way. And she really seems to be in denial of how chaotic Web 1 was and Web 2. And so, yeah, there's this weird amnesia going on.
Yeah.
So it happens with everything.
Yeah, and what struck me about the Pessimist Archive is how reliable this is, that whenever there's a new hysteria about something that is going to be destroying the world, you can always look and find something. My favorite was you did an article recently when the New York Times bought Wordle. You did an article about how the New York Times thought crossword puzzle. The New York Times is practically synonymous with the concept of the crossword puzzle.
Yeah.
But when they first, the first crossword puzzle swept the nation, they thought it was terrible.
Yeah, no, stupid fad, trashy. It's a lot of it stuff. I think it's like based in classism as well. Like it was a tabloid thing that like working class people did, and they were above it all. And the Sunday Times in London had a similar attitude, but it only took them 10 years to give in, and then the New York Times took a bit longer. But yeah, now it's a huge part of their business, and doing crosswords is seen as an intelligent pastime. Um, uh, but yeah, there's some weird puritanical classist thing going on where, like, if there's something that a lot of people are doing and it's fun, the commentariat are like, oh,
If the
this is
masses
for
are enjoying themselves,
morons.
if the masses are
Oh,
enjoying themselves, it must be wrong.
oh, those plebs, just disgusting. It's bicycles too. I mean, the penny farthing was for rich people, and then suddenly everyone was running around on a bicycle in the 1890s, and it was just like, oh god, these plebs and their bicycles. Actually, the same thing happened with smartphones, right? Like, PDAs were like classy, like you're a high flying businessman, and now it's like moronic. Having a smartphone is the sort of moron. It's a moronic thing.
Oh yeah, it was
Yeah,
totally elite thing to be wedded to your BlackBerry.
BlackBerry, yeah, exactly. And now it's just like, oh, smartphones are it's just so mainstream. It's so not cool. It's so plebeian. Yeah, it's a weird thing.
Yeah.
Classes and sexism, technology, cultural change,
Well, and
populism all mixed
talking
together.
about the persistence of this and how widespread it is. I remember seeing just recently somebody writing an article about in favor of email as a more long form, more thoughtful alternative to text messaging. And the funny thing is, I'm old enough to remember when people wrote those articles about email versus letter writing, right? About how, we've lost the art of writing a letter because we're all just doing everything by email. And there's always this nostalgia. So what do you think is driving this? Is it just sort of a psychological tick or a psychological defense mechanism of some kind?
Yeah, I think yeah, I'm really interested in nostalgia generally as an emotion. Um, there's we're stuck in the present, right? We're stuck in the present. We can't escape it. The future isn't certain. It never is. So there's this like uncertainty to that, which is a bit like jarring. And then you've got the past, where like we cannot go back to the past. And so there's like scarcity bias going on. It's like this thing, when there's a last piece of cake, it's just like, oh, the cake's so much more appealing when there's one piece left, or like definitely scarcity bias going on. It's like there's this thing that we actually cannot have. So it just at the value we place on it is extremely high. And the other thing is like, I think we don't generally, unless you're like depressed or whatever, you generally don't remember bad things, or you compartmentalize them and you only remember the good things.
There's actually a documented,
you sort of have a highlight reel.
Right. There's a documented phenomenon by which memories of the past tend to be selected in favor of the positive memories, and a lot of the negative stuff gets deselected out. And that's why we always have this sort of rosy nostalgia towards the past. One of the things I'm thinking of is, we talk about this being a bipartisan thing. Was I breaking up? Am I back?
You were, but now you're back. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. It just happens like a second or so here and there. I'll edit it out. All right. So one thing that struck me about is, Marxism is viewed as sort of a radical philosophy. So people don't, I think, realize often how conservative it sometimes was, that it was, in a way, it was a reaction to, people are working in factories and that's terrible, right? And let's imagine all the terrible bad consequences that can come from people working in factories. And I thought about that when I saw something you wrote where you mentioned the PRO Act, where it's basically targeting the gig economy, because it's now like, well, people are no longer working in factories and that's terrible. So it's like, whatever the new whatever the new way of doing things is, people imagine it's the Black Mirror approach, right? There's a whole British television show that's basically every episode is, let's take some aspect of new technology and imagine how horrible it could be.
Yeah, I mean, that stuff, sci-fi, dystopian sci-fi stuff is extremely influential culturally. I'd say that it's become like science folklore, because it's not just fiction, it's folklore. Is like, they're not religious, like sometimes they are, but like they're not always religious, but they create a framework of thinking about the world and morality in the future. Which is a lot of what has happened in science fiction. the article you wrote recently, you mentioned this New Yorker piece. I can't remember the title. It was something like, do you remember the New Yorker article about science fiction?
I'm trying to remember which one I did.
I'm blanking.
About how
I think
the techno-pessimism of it, or
did I share it with you? Yeah, it was just an interesting piece about how like we've become culturally obsessed with science fiction, dystopian science fiction, and it's come to like shape our view of the future and technology, which is something I've really thought about a lot. And it's yeah, go on.
I was going to say, I find this to be absolutely endemic when it comes to artificial intelligence. That, you know, the Terminator movies are basically lodged. The Terminator movies and all the various other versions of it, Ultron or whatever, they're permanently lodged in people's consciousness as their vision for what artificial intelligence is going to be. And it's like they don't have a positive vision of what it would be.
No, there's rarely like I never hear like all the sort of predictions are all dark and stuff, and it's like okay, yes, like AI can discriminate, right? But also it can highlight discrimination which was invisible before, you know? Like for every negative there can be a positive, but like there's never that kind of distinction there. And like there was this article that was a drone has been built to detect human screams, right? And it just sort of conjured up this image of these sort of evil drones hunting down people, and like, but it was a drone to save people, to keep people safe. Like all these examples of like AI are like being used to find sharks and warn people, and like detect screams in a burning building, and like all this other stuff. But still, even the drone that's saving a screaming child from a burning building, the editors of newspapers are like, this is black. And it happened in the early pandemic. Like there were robots being used to deliver food to people in quarantine, and people were like, "Oh, this is a bit Black Mirror." It's like, is it? Because I thought Black Mirror was supposed to be the robots harming the humans, not protecting them from a virus. Like it's just
not
really,
bringing them
but like
food,
I say,
yeah.
But it's become, like I said, like secular fables, and it's a problem. And I've got this thesis, the Black Mirror fallacy, or where that has infected academia, government, journalism, and we basically see through this lens, and we just end up making the most horrendous missteps and mistakes by trying to prevent dystopia. We end up creating it. You go, oh,
go ahead.
We try and prevent dystopia with these sort of crazy visions of dystopian sci-fi, but then we end up creating a dystopia of technological stagnation. I call it, you've got techno dystopia, I say it's no tech dystopia, right? You flip the words around and it's like, it feels like we're living in that, right? Like polio is coming back, people are scared of vaccines. The pandemic was prolonged because people were scared of vaccines. Germany's like more vulnerable to Russian influence and sort of leverage with energy because they spent 20 years fighting against nuclear power. Sri Lanka's went organic and it's exacerbated their food crisis. Like we're living, it's like a reverse Black Mirror. And, yet we continue to talk about these, we continue to talk about in terms of like dystopian sci-fi. And there's long-termism has become a big topic in the last few weeks, which is great, but it can be perverted and like, you could see the way Germany treats nuclear power as long-termism, right? Like you overstate the risk of nuclear waste and you're like, well, we need to think about the people in 1,000 years' time. It's like, okay, well, they're not going to have to deal with nuclear waste, but like perhaps the oceans will have risen so much that they're going to be completely screwed anyway. Do you know what I mean? So it's like long-termism. At the moment I'm focusing on how long-termism can be perverted and distorted to basically just have the precautionary principle on steroids and end up harming people in 1,000 years rather than helping them.
Well, I also think with long-termism, there's an element of Malthusianism to it. This idea that, Malthus basically, you project forward the current trends and say, oh, well, if we have more population and, at the current trends, we'll all run out of food. And you don't realize that, well, as you have more economic growth and more technological progress and more population, you'll have people going out and solving all those problems, and you'll have a hyperabundance of food. Your biggest social problem is going to be obesity. This idea, this long-termism sort of, I think, tends to really the version of long-termism you're talking about tends to discount the ability of future people to solve the problems that, 1,000 years from now, nuclear waste is going to be, a trivial problem given, 1,000 years of additional technological growth. You think they're not going to be able to deal with this.
Yeah, that too. And also the scary thing about the sort of, I'm going to coin this term, Luddite long-termism, to talk about this. But Elon Musk has talked a lot about sentient AI being a threat, and there's I think it's the Future of Life Institute in the UK that's funded by Musk and a bunch of other tech people, and there is a sort of a cohort of technologists who'd think wouldn't be sort of going down that route, but they are, which I feel like, I'm not discounting their completely, but it's like we need to remember that, like, everyone's doing this anyway. Like, you know what I mean? It's not like there's a lack of hand-wringing and anxiety and like paranoia and hypochondria about modernity. Like, that's a hardwired human thing. And I think that it feels to me like the bigger risk is over compensating or being overly cautious in creating the dystopia we're trying to avoid, like by being too technophobic. I think that feels like it's proving out now more than ever, and it feels like we.
I was going to say that you mentioned that you mentioned the precautionary principle, and I think that the precautionary principle becomes this mechanism by which all, this bias, this Black Mirror fallacy, this bias to think only of the negative consequences, and you combine that with the precautionary principle, you basically would have to stop all innovation. We have to stop everything now because you never know what's going to happen, what bad thing's going to happen from some new technology.
And we started, like, we started this century with these long-termist ideas in a way, which were like, there was this vision of the new millennium being this extremely futuristic thing, millennium like science and technology, and robot dogs were these cute little things, futuristic things in the early 2000s. They've become this like dystopian thing thanks to Black Mirror, but like there was this vision. I remember it quite clearly when I was younger. And then gradually, as we approached the year 2000, all these like modern doomsday prophecies creeped in about genetic engineering, and then about the computer age and the millennium bug. And there was this stuff that these really scary scenarios. And so, like, the second that the 21st century started, it was foretold that the whole of civilization would collapse because there was this computer bug, and it would, planes would fall out the sky, and everything would be grounded. The world economy would ground to a halt. That was literally the main narrative around the turn of the new century, which is crazy, paranoid, almost sort of, doomsday cultish.
No, I think I have to explain for the whippersnappers out there. I have to explain what the Y2K bug was. So this is, the early computers had memory was extremely scarce. I remember when a 64K computer was like this massive amount of memory, which is this tiny amount of memory. But memory is so scarce that they stored the years in a 2-digit format. So 1969 would just be 69. And then the concern was you had all these old programs still out there running. The concern was that when the year 2000 came, all these programs would think it was the year 1900 and everything would crash and it would all grind to a halt. And it was, I remember the hysteria built up over this. This is going to be a disaster. And it kind of fizzled out. Nothing really had, a bunch of software engineers went out and they patched it and it all turned out fine. But I think that the Y2K bug I find fascinating because remembering that period, I think what happened, part of it, what was behind that was, it was the first time that a lot of people felt their lives were dependent on or deeply involved with computers. But at the same time, probably the majority of people didn't own it. We didn't all have supercomputers in our pocket yet. The majority of people didn't actually themselves own a computer. So it was like that sense of dependence, but combined with unfamiliarity.
Yeah, and that sort of desperate feeling of like it's too late. It's like we built a house of cards and it's too late. We're not going to escape this. And the Millennium Bug was known about for a long time. It was known about for a long time, and we knew what the cure was. We knew what the solution was. It was a small patch, and there was a lot of patches to do, and they needed to be done. But it was this like idea that we couldn't handle it. The idea that like there's a problem, we know the solution, we have some time, but no, we flew too close to the sun. Our wings are melting. It's over. And it's funny because at the time, Bill Gates dismissed it. He said, "This is not an issue. Everyone calm down." And I think probably at the time, people were like, "Oh, this is corporate propaganda. This is Bill Gates created this mess, and now he's just dismissing it." I think it's funny because, fast forward to 2014, I think it was, and Gates is warning the world about a bug, but it's a biological bug, a global pandemic. Everyone ignored him, and then the global pandemic came, and a bug did bring the world to a standstill in many of the same ways that were predicted about the Millennium Bug, but it was a biological bug that emerged from nature. I know there's some debate about it being a lab-born thing, but the idea that it wasn't digital is very interesting to me, and the fact that that's actually what brought the world to a standstill is so interesting. And the fact that Gates dismissed the Millennium Bug, but he predicted the global pandemic, which again was inevitable. We knew these things happened. It had been a long time. And at the beginning of the new century, we should have, any expert knew that this was a problem. Yet we were just obsessed with the computer age being the Achilles heel of modern civilization. And then it turns out the bug came, it brought the world to a standstill. And what kept the world running, what kept the economy going, what kept, things from collapsing further was the computer age, was the information age, was the internet, and all of these computers, which is almost like a mirror of what was predicted, and then what's even funnier is that the vaccines for that biological bug, one of them involved genetically engineered virus, the others used mRNA. And so you go back to the beginning of the century and it's like genetic engineering and the computer age is going to end civilization. You fast forward 20 years and it's like, that's what saved us. That's what kept things solid. And to me, that's the epitome of the Black Mirror fallacy or the Frankenstein fallacy or the Prometheus fallacy, whatever you want to call it. It's just we got it so wrong. The press and the commentariat got it so wrong. And it's just proving out now that these paranoid visions are, not only can they be wrong, but they can lead us to do things that actually make the thing you're trying to avoid even worse, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so that's one thing I want to get to too, which is you talk about the sort of Luddite populism, and I want to talk about the sort of the political ramifications. One of the things you talk about is that the technological ramification is we get over-regulated, over-restricted growth of technology, and Germany shutting down its nuclear power plants, things like that. But I think you also get, I've been fascinated by the connection of this sort of extreme pessimism to politics and to the defense of a free society, that you're more likely to accept. It seems to me that you're more likely to accept an illiberal solution to our political problems if you think the world's coming to an end and everything's going downhill and everything was better when I was a kid.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's textbook populism, the good old days, nostalgia. I mean, I see sort of toxic populism is just weaponized nostalgia. I don't know, it's crossed my mind at times that you need it to win an election. Like, but then in other ways, like Obama ran on a very optimistic vision, um, that I don't recall harking back to the good old days. I mean, my memory's a little foggy, but it's hope and change is a optimistic vision. American Carnage, not so much. um, so yeah, but I believe that you never see politicians running on a tech progressive platform. And I wrote a piece recently about Peter Thiel and his candidates, and how, you know, you'd assume that like these ex-Founders Fund partners who, you know, the slogan of Founders Fund is like, we wanted flying cars, instead we got 140 characters. Like, you'd assume they'd be running on tech progressive platform, talking about like solving the, you know, the scarcity that's causing all the conflict in society. You'd assume that they'd be leaning into that, and like they have in nuclear power in some ways, but in other ways, like Blake Masters praised the Unabomber, like he complained about automated checkout tills. It's like, so I don't. It's crazy that the people that you'd think, oh yeah, those would be the sort of kind of politicians that would run on that platform aren't, and I think it's a massive mistake. And I think someone needs to step in and do that. I think the Democrats have a good chance of doing that. And talk about abundance, technology, development. I know in the UK, Keir Starmer of the Labour Party is talking about nuclear power. He's talking about you know, technological acceleration as a solution to the current situation, which is extremely promising. I didn't expect to see that. Obviously, before him was Corbyn, who was very sort of against that kind of thing generally. So yeah, there's a big opportunity there for candidates on all sides of the political spectrum to focus in on that. And I think that going the cynical route and being technophobic and being sort of a Luddite populist is a mistake. I think people are bored of the populism now, the war, blah, blah. Like, people want to hear something good news, something hopeful. And
yeah. So Jim Pethokoukis in his newsletter, he's one of these he's a techno optimist and is an advocate for, he calls the Upwing Approach. And he posted something recently with a photo of Ronald Reagan visiting the set of Star Trek: The Next Generation and meeting with Patrick Stewart. You know, so there's Ronald Reagan and Jean-Luc Picard, and it's a blast from the past there. But it's sort of, you know, that he was a candidate who ran on a more optimistic vision and said some, you know, specific things about that. And Star Trek: The Next Generation was, generally speaking, a more techno optimistic. I mean, if you want to talk about, you know, a positive vision of AI, it's the Star Trek computer, right? Where you ask the computer a question and it answers you. It comes up with a definitive answer. It understands exactly what you're saying and immediately comes up with a definitive answer. That's the positive vision of AI. So I guess the question I'm saying is, you know, so what I love about Pessimist Archive is it sort of makes fun of or you know, exposes this tendency to always see a negative view of new technology. But what do we need to do to sort of create and promote a more positive vision of new technology?
It's tricky, and I mean, again, I think historical analogies are very powerful to convince people, right? Like at the moment, talking about Germany and nuclear power, looking at Sri Lanka and all, like, you need to look at these things because, you know, when there's something new and scary and unfamiliar, and then you have this uncertain future ahead of you, it's really hard. It's like really hard for people to be optimistic. It just feels naive and foolish and risky, and you know, everyone's feeding into that. But then to be able to say, look, this has happened before, and like, look how things turned out. Like, it feels like the vaccine, the mental vaccine to the tendency we have to fear new things. So yeah, you've got to dig up that history and look at it, and it feels like mainstream history doesn't include that kind of stuff. Like the fact that the New York Times said Edison has invented too many things a year before he perfected the incandescent light bulb feels like it should be like a world famous anecdote that's taught in every history class in the world, but it's not.
She'll never fly, Orville.
Hear it.
There is a sort of a figure of speech, she'll never fly, Orville, about the people who thought that the
Perfect.
Wright brothers weren't going to succeed.
So it's important to tell that history and understand it, and that's it's the mission of the project.
So tell you
that's
the mission of the Pessimist Archive project.
Yes, it's to make sure that untold history is there and it's not forgotten, it's not glossed over, and the sort of collective amnesia we have about how we felt about new things is sort of corrected. There's a need for an organization to deal with technophobia in general, more bridging the gap between obviously the history and the past and the present debates about technology. There's a lot of terrible journalism, there's a lot of terrible research and policies happening all the time. I think some Republicans want to put an 18-year-old age limit on social media, which is absurd because we know kids aren't going to, they're just going to lie about their age and use it anyway. And it's going to be harder to protect kids online than it is already, because we're not going to know who's a kid and who isn't. So there's just so much awful journalism, public policy, and research going on, and there needs to be an organization to call it out, to make fun of it, to hold the people that are pushing it forward accountable. A lot of it is very like opportunistic, populist, sort of cynical, attention-seeking, right? And there needs to be an organization to deal with that. So that's something I'm exploring at the moment, and the Black Mirror fallacy thesis is sort of the underlying thing of that.
I'm Rob Trzynski with Symposium. My guest today has been Louis Anslow, creator of the Pessimist Archive. If you like this video, plus like and subscribe on our YouTube channel or to our podcast. And you can always find more ideas and analysis and more discussion about the nature of free society at symposium.substack.com. Thank you for joining the conversation.